I would like to introduce you to the 6th drawer in this storage unit. This is where all of the art supplies that I haven't tested out yet go, and as you can see, it's pretty full. So today I'm finally going to be going through some of the stuff that's in here and test it out. First up is this golden black ink. Now when I got this, it was pretty much entirely an impulse purchase because this concept intrigued me so much. Its premise is that it's this black ink that basically has gold particles suspended in it, and when the ink dries, the black kind of sinks into the paper, which makes the gold shine through. And I really had no idea how gold this ink was going to end up, so I was trying to think of something gold that I wanted to draw, and the first thing that came to mind was the armorer from The Mandalorian, because she has this incredible gold helmet, which, as you can see in this footage, right now this ink looks entirely black, which, yes, I would say for the line art, I think the line art ended up looking far more black than the other things, and I think I kind of figured out the trick for this ink, and that is the more you somewhat dilute the ink, and it's not even necessarily noticeable, like the black still looks almost as black as just using the ink straight from the bottle almost, but for some reason when you add just the slightest bit of water to it, it possibly thins out the black pigment just a slight bit so that it sinks into the paper more. I think this is my theory. I think that adding a touch of water means that the black just sinks into the paper more, which makes the gold shine through a lot more, because as you can see around the neck area and when I started to actually use the ink in more of a shading capacity and not so much in a line art, it definitely started to look more gold. I do think this is an interesting product and I don't really have any issues with it. If anything, I would just say that it's not necessarily going to be used as much as some of my other inks, just because it is somewhat unpredictable, because even though I have this theory about what makes the gold shine through more, it is ultimately just that, a theory, and there's a lot of room for, I wouldn't necessarily say error, but a lot of room for variance in the gold shining through and just the overall look of things. So I do think this is an interesting product, and I do see myself using this more in a sketching capacity, like in a line art heavy drawing, not necessarily a fully shaded in ink illustration like I tried here. And as the ink dried, it did get more gold, which is what that clip was, and here is what the final gold result looks like for this piece. I also wanted to try it out in a line art only capacity just to see if my theory of the watering down worked, and this is where you can definitely see it, because more on the left side of the succulents is where I used the ink pretty much at full strength, and then I gradually tried watering it down as I kind of moved over to the right side, and I think that side definitely looks more gold, or at least the gold seemingly comes through just a little stronger in those areas. So overall, I do think this is a really interesting product, and I think for the right project, it's going to look incredible. But I do see that project being more of a complete line art based type of illustration. Next up are these FineLine Applicator pens. Now, this particular art tool, I guess you could call it, I've seen used in a lot of different ways. Some people use them for masking fluid, but I bought these for a very specific reason that I'm going to get into. The premise of these applicators is you have a refillable tube with an extraordinarily fine applicator on the end, and when I first saw these or heard about these, I immediately thought of creating a super fine and pigmented white ink pen. These particular ones are definitely in more of a pen-like configuration, which is why I sort of jumped into more of an art material sort of usage for these. Although I do have multiple ones, so I can really use them for whatever I want, but I am someone that uses a fairly decent amount of white ink in their work, and I'm always on the hunt to try and find an incredibly pigmented white solution that I'm happy with. And, you know, I do have my favorite gel pens, but sometimes they just don't quite cut it. But one of the things that I'm always happy with the look of is white acrylic ink. and normally you are using that with either a brush or a dip pen, and this was just an interesting alternative to me to use it in more of a pen-like application. You know, it's already in the tube, super easy to use, you know, you don't have to continuously go back and forth dipping in a pen into the ink bottle or fighting with a brush or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I did already use this footage in my last video, and lots of you were interested in what this was, so clearly this was an incredibly interesting product to a lot of people, and I totally get it because these white lines are pretty impressive, honestly, in pigmentation. The only thing I will say about this, just from spending a decent amount of time with it, I did use it in a few other illustrations outside of this one, is you do have to be quite fast with it, because you're basically, it's up to gravity that the ink is kind of flowing out of the tube, and sometimes it can blob up a little more than you would like. But other than that, honestly, I find this bottle to be very well designed. I had this acrylic ink in it for a few days, and I used it in a few other pieces, and there were absolutely no drying issues. Like, it was still completely fluid in the bottle, so as you can see, there's not very much in the tube at the moment, just because, you know, a little bit of acrylic ink can go a long way, but I still have a tiny bit left over in this tube on my desk now, and it still appears to be as good as the day that I put it in the tube. So overall, I really love these bottles, and I am really happy with how these worked for my intended purpose, although I think I'm gonna try filling one of these with some masking fluid as well, just because I have multiples and, you know, I don't really need 3 white ink pens laying around. I do already use something similar for masking fluid, but I think the design of this bottle and it being more like a pen as opposed to a small bottle is going to make something like intricate masking fluid application even easier. Yeah, overall, really love these bottles, and I can't wait to figure out other ways of how to use them. Next up is this watercolor granulation medium. I actually bought this product years ago in like a crazy clearance. It cost me only like a couple of dollars, which is pretty much the only reason why I got it. It's a slightly strange product, but I was willing to try it because it did sound interesting. The entire premise of this product is to improve the granulation of your watercolors. And if you don't know what granulation is, it's basically the texture almost of the watercolor. Really high-end watercolor paints will kind of boast about their incredible granulation, and it's just kind of that segmented pulling apart texture that you probably associate with watercolor paint. I figured the best way to truly test this product was to do a comparison with and without using the granulation medium. So the gradient that I just created is just using it like straight with water, you know, usual way to use watercolors, and then this texture on the left is using the granulation medium. Now, I did use it according to the bottle, which you're basically substituting using water to activate your paints with this medium. So I did end up washing out my brush with water, but other than that, the paints themselves I tried to keep completely activated using only the medium. Now for this, I was using my Daniel Smith paints, which are very high-end watercolors, so in theory they already have a decent amount of granulation already, although these particular colors aren't necessarily highly granulating colors, which is also why I wanted to do a test with some of the more color-splitting colors, because something like Moonglow, which is what I'm trying out here, tends to be very granulating on its own, and I wanted to see if this medium would possibly make the granulation even more prominent. And here is what my test looked like completely dry. You can definitely see a bit of difference, though I'm not sure if I would call it improved granulation. If anything, the granulation fluid actually made the paints more difficult to blend evenly, I found. It was just kind of strange because it does look like you're using water with these paints, but then it just doesn't act the same as actually using water. The pigment strangely seems to be a little more intense using the granulation fluid, so it's kind of a weird trade-off. But like I mentioned before, the colors that I was using weren't necessarily very granulating colors on their own to begin with. And here's what my test swatches are of the two color changing colors that I decided to use the fluid with as well. And for this, I do think that there is possibly an improved granulation. You definitely can see it in Moonglow a lot more than Rose of Ultramarine. It also could possibly have something to do with the texture of the paper. I'm not entirely sure. It is an interesting fluid, although I'm not quite sure what applications I might have for it in my own work, just because, like I said, my watercolors themselves I don't find to be not granulating enough for my personal preference. So if you are an artist that uses this granulation fluid or a similar product in your work, let me know, and let me know possibly what you use it for or how I possibly should try it out for some of my work. But overall, not a bad product. I'm just not quite sure where I see this fitting into my art routine. Next product test, Crackle paste. Now, I very rarely use acrylic paint as my medium of choice for my work, but that does not stop me from being endlessly fascinated by all of the different mediums that are made for acrylic paint use. And this Crackle paste was no exception. I have no idea how I found out about this particular medium, but somehow it ended up in my studio to try out. Now, the premise behind this product is that you put it on, possibly, there are very minimal instructions, and I really probably should have looked up a YouTube video or something of somebody using this, but the idea is you put a decent layer of this medium onto your page, canvas, whatever that might be, and then over time it cracks. Now, I had no idea how much this would inevitably end up cracking, so I did first try it in my watercolor sketchbook over the texture, just so that there was some color behind the cracks so that you could possibly see the definition of the cracks a little better, but upon further inspection of the bottle, it does recommend using it on a stiffer board. So I did a very similar idea on some canvas board piece that I just had laying around, and I tried the same thing. Now, on the bottle, it does mention that the thicker the layer of the Crackle paste, the more it cracks. Who knows how thick that layer might be, so I did a bit of variance of thickness of this paste, just to see in my test how thick it might be or what the differences are between the thickness of the material. I also wasn't entirely sure whether I should completely smooth it out, so I did leave it with a bit of texture as well. On the packaging, it does mention how the cracks can take days to appear, so these tests were after 12 or so hours, and then this was it again after a couple of days, and I don't see a massive difference in either of those tests. I think at some point it does sort of hit a wall, and that's about all of the cracks that you're going to get. So here are the differences between the two. The canvas board definitely cracked more interestingly and evenly. I was at one point concerned that it wasn't going to crack at all on the watercolor paper, but it did, so that's great. Overall, it is a super interesting look, although I kind of wish that it would almost crack even more so you could see more of that color coming through. It might do that if you do an even thicker layer than I did. I also find that it does possibly look a little better when it is kind of fully smoothed out without that sort of palette knife texture across the surface. But as you can see, even when I started to thin things out more on the canvas board test, it did still crack, just the cracks were not as prominent. So for this, I definitely would recommend using a stiffer board. I don't even think that taping down your watercolor paper super securely would necessarily even give you as good of a result as the stiff board, just because paper does still flex more. But I definitely could see myself using this as a really interesting background and texturing element, possibly even coloring the medium itself. And the last materials that I'm going to be trying out are these various brush pens. Now, originally I thought these pens were basically the exact same pen, just in small, medium, and large, but each of the sizes actually has its own unique nib, which I actually like. The medium-sized nib, which is what I use for the majority of this illustration, is actually a fiber brush nib. similar to the Pentel brush pen, although spoiler alert, I do like that one better than this one. Not that this one's particularly bad, it is still a really good brush pen, but anyway. The large nib is more like a Copic brush marker type of nib, like it is a felt nib, like it's definitely not an actual brush fiber nib, and the small pen is also similar to that, although the nib is obviously a lot smaller and harder. It actually reminds me a lot of the Tombow Mono calligraphy type of pens, the one that has the stronger, less flexible nib. Now, the packaging was basically entirely in Japanese, so I have no idea what sort of specifications it might have mentioned on that, so I really wanted to put these to the test, and one of those tests was to see how waterproof they were. Now, I did decide to actually add the watercolor pretty soon after finishing the inking, so they really didn't have any time for the ink to set or dry, but overall, the ink did not smudge that much. Like, it's definitely more water resistant than waterproof. It really wasn't causing me that much of a problem, but there was a bit of graying in some areas, but that, like I said, that could have been just because I really didn't let the ink set that much. But it wasn't like a complete running black ink catastrophe. I also wasn't scrubbing that much at the lines with my brush, so if you were doing more of a painting in that way, there could be a bit of an issue, but as far as water application on top of the ink goes, it really doesn't smudge that much. So overall, they're pretty decent pens. They're kind of average, you know, they're not terrible, they're not like mind-blowing, they're just really good pens. I guess the only downside would be that you really can't refill the inks, so obviously the medium pen, like I mentioned before, is pretty similar to the Pentel brush pen, and that is a pen that you can easily get ink refills for, so that's definitely a benefit of that one over this one. But yeah, overall, I'm happy with them, and I'm definitely going to use them fairly regularly because I am someone that enjoys using more brush pen-like nibs. And those are all of the art supplies that I'm going to test in this video. Let me know if any of these in particular you use regularly in your work, but I hope you enjoyed seeing me put these materials to the test. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.